Richard Pang Hall was reassigned to the low residency Master of Fine Arts program in fiction, poetry, and personal nonfiction, memoir. Thus had the writers come to Richard Pang Hall on the campus of Ripley College in this strange corner of northern Vermont, close enough to the fabled Northeast Kingdom to bear some trace of its distinct oddness. The area had been home to a small but hardy Christian cult since the 1970s, but not so far from Burlington and Hanover as to be completely in the back of beyond. Of course, creative writing had been taught at the college since the 1950s, but never in any serious, let alone enterprising way. Things got added to the curriculum of every educational institution concerned with survival as the culture changed around it, and as the students began, in their eternally studenty way, to make demands. Women's studies, African American studies, a computer center that actually acknowledged computers were, a thing. But when Ripley underwent its great crisis in the late 1980s, and when the college took a sober and deeply trepidatious look at what might be required for actual institutional survival, it was, surprise, the creative writing that signaled the most optimistic way forward. And so it had launched its first, and still only, graduate program, the Ripley Symposia in Creative Writing, and over the following years the symposia basically ate up the rest of the college until all that was left was its low residency program, so much more accommodating for students who couldn't drop everything for a 2-year MFA course, and shouldn't be expected to. Writing, according to Ripley's own glossy prospectus and highly enticing website, was not some elitist activity out of bounds to all but the fortunate few. Every single person had a unique voice and a story nobody else could tell. And anybody, especially with the guidance and support of the Ripley Symposia, could be a writer. All Jacob Finch Bonner had ever wanted to be was a writer. Ever, ever, ever. All the way back to suburban Long Island, which was the last place on earth a serious artist of any kind ought to come from, but where he, nonetheless, had been cursed to grow up, the only child of a tax attorney and a high school guidance counselor. Why he'd affixed his star to the forlorn little shelf in his local library marked Authors from Long Island was anyone's guess, but it did not pass unnoticed in the young writer's home. His father, the tax attorney, had been forceful in his objections. Writers didn't make money, except Sidney Sheldon. Was Jake claiming he was the next Sidney Sheldon? And his mother, the guidance counselor, had seen fit to remind him constantly of his mediocre at best PSAT score on the verbal side. It was greatly embarrassing to Jake that he'd managed to do better on the math than the verbal. These had been grievous challenges to overcome, but what artist was without challenges to overcome? He'd read stubbornly, and, it should be noted, already competitively, and with envy, throughout his childhood, departing the mandatory curriculum, leapfrogging the usual adolescent dross to vet the emerging field of his future rivals. Then off he had gone to Wesleyan to study creative writing, falling in with a tight group of fellow proto-novelists and short story writers who were just as insanely competitive as he was. Many were the dreams of young Jacob Finch Bonner when it came to the fiction he would one day write. The Bonner, in point of fact, wasn't entirely authentic. Jake's paternal great-grandfather had substituted Bonner for Bernstein a solid century before, but neither was the Finch, which Jake himself had added in high school as an homage to the novel that awakened his love of fiction. Sometimes, with books he especially loved, he imagined that he had actually written them himself and was giving